Hello there. Um, Greetings. Sorry about that. We had a little bit of technical difficulties. Welcome to our webinar today. Um, we are excited for the webinar that we're about to do. We have been able to partner with the Asian Association of Utah to bring you a pretty awesome summer webinar series on human trafficking. And today we're going to begin that with human trafficking in housing. And I'm going to go over a couple of housekeeping tips with you. First off, we'd like to thank the Office of Violence Against Women for funding our webinars. We do enjoy doing these webinars, and we hope that you enjoy the information that you gather during the webinar. Lastly, this webinar is interactive. Please ask your questions. We have two experts here to not only answer your questions, but give you that information that you definitely need. So I'm going to show you a little bit on how your control panel works. So if you see this expanded control panel on your screen, great. If not, go ahead and click that little orange arrow button, and that will expand or retract your control panel. Secondly, we have this little raise your hand button. Or you can use it to, ask a question. I can address something. We use that a little bit, especially if one of our presenters asks a question and just kind of wants a consensus of the folks that are on the webinar to kind of answer. And lastly, we have this question box. So the question box is something that we are going to utilize throughout this webinar. And of course, if you've been on any of our other webinars, this is the one thing that we do utilize the most. So if I could have everyone type in there who you are, where you're from, are you an advocate, are you law enforcement, are you from Utah, what county are you in? Just type in there like you would be typing a question, and let's see who we have with us. Ooh, it looks like we have a couple folks from the Moab area. We have folks from Davis County. We have folks from Western Utah. We got Ogden. Gosh, we got people from all across the state. Ooh, we got someone from Alabama here. Love it, love it. That's very cool. Ooh, folks from Utah County. Awesome, awesome. Thank you, everyone. That's great. Okay, and so just a little bit about the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition, of course. So we're the state anti-domestic violence coalition for the state of Utah. So we're the federally recognized coalition. And we provide support, training, technical assistance for all organizations and folks who work with survivors of domestic and sexual violence throughout the state of Utah. Yeah, so a little bit about me. I will be facilitating this webinar. And so I am Andy Tremonti. I work for the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator. I do a webinar every 2 weeks, and during the summer, it's going to be maybe every week. And my educational history is in psychology and women and gender studies, which just happens to go really well with what we're talking about 8 years, and of course it's going on 9 years of working with LGBTQIA folks and other underserved survivors of all forms of trauma. So here's a couple cute pics. I got a picture on the left, little Dungeons and Dragons. That's my self-care, my hobby. When I'm not doing this, when I'm not thinking about all that terrible, the terrible stuff that happens in our world, I'm practicing just a little bit of very creative self-care. And of course, my cats are on the right. We have Totoko on the left and Jorge on the right. All right. So I am going to give control over to Allison, and Allison is going to introduce herself, and then Erin is going to introduce herself. So enjoy.
Good morning. This is Allison Smith, and I am the Education and Outreach Specialist for the Trafficking in Persons program at the Refugee Immigrant Center Asian Association of Utah. And I am delighted to be with you guys today. We'll be talking about a variety of things, but basically my job is to go throughout the state and do education and training related to human trafficking. And so it's a privilege to be with you all, and we look forward to engaging with you.
And my name is Erin Drum, and I am the housing coordinator in the Trafficking in Persons program at the Refugee and Immigrant Center Asian Association of Utah. I moved to Utah from Seattle a year ago, so I'm still new to the area, but loving the mountains, excited to be with you all today. And my role within the agency is to create more opportunities for housing for survivors of trafficking so that we can address each unique survivor's needs with an individual housing plan. So Allison will be doing the bulk of the presentation this morning, and I will be chiming in with some more housing related pieces, but we are happy that you all are here with us.
Okay, let's get started. I'm just going to advance my slide, and I'm trying to do that and it's not. Sorry, you guys, so just right off, definitely not IT savvy. Andy's going to help me here. Okay, so first of all, we are delighted to be here, and it is through a grant through the Utah Victims of Crime, and we're delighted to be able to utilize the resources they provided for us to be able to do this webinar today. Really quickly, we're going to run through just kind of what we plan to cover today. Once we're done, you all will be able to define human trafficking and recognize potential indicators of trafficking. You'll also be able to summarize risk factors for victimization. We're going to talk about that in detail and the dynamics of control at play in the human trafficking dynamic. Then finally, we're going to look at things through that kind of trauma-informed, victim-centered lens, and especially as it relates to you all serving survivors and in the housing context. So really quickly, we're going to define human trafficking, and we use that and we do that through what we call the AMP model, action, means, and purpose. So in terms of the statute is the Utah statute, and just for your information, it mirrors the federal statute. And so anyway, that is important for you to know. A lot of states don't necessarily have the same statute as the federal laws. So really quickly, action. An action that a potential trafficker would take in terms of the law and it becoming a crime is, as you can see them here, recruiting, for example. Another one would be advertising, so taking someone's picture and advertising them online. And so those are just a couple examples. You can see the other ones there. The means whereby that occurs is through force, fraud, or coercion. And we're going to talk about that in some detail. And then for the purpose of commercial sex or forced labor or service, I want to make one thing really clear, and that is that no force, fraud, or coercion, that middle element, the means, those are not needed to be shown or proven in the context of a juvenile and sex trafficking, or that commercial sex element there under the purpose. So for example, if we have a minor and we're looking at whether or not someone was trafficked, the only thing that is needed to be shown is that these actions were taken on the left there for the purpose of commercial sex. We can completely skip the means piece. And of course, that has everything to do with the ability of the minor to consent. And so that is why the law makes this exception for a juvenile as related to sex trafficking. In terms of force, some examples of force would include physical force, right? So, elements that involve that. It also involves things like repeated beatings or burning, sexual assault, rape, a variety of dynamics like that. Kind of a constant torture practice, things like that. That is viewed as force. It doesn't have to be necessarily, taking somebody and tying them up to something and literally physically forcing them, although that does include that. In terms of fraud, fraud is basically a big fat lie. We'll just say it that way, but of course it never ever comes across like a lie. It is a misrepresentation, deception. It is someone telling someone and promising someone something that in fact they have no intention to follow through on. And they may say they have intentions or had intentions, but in fact things are not followed through on. So the person's not paid what they were promised. Their living conditions are not what they promised. The glamorous life of a model, for example, that's one of the potential recruitment pieces for sex trafficking often, especially when it comes to juveniles. That, of course, that glamorous life is what's promised, but of course that does not come to pass. And then coercion is where a trafficker will utilize a vulnerability that individuals have, and we all have them. If we have anyone or anything, an animal or a person or anything we care about, that can be viewed by a trafficker, and that is in fact a vulnerability. A trafficker and anyone who's trying to take advantage of another person, but in this instance a trafficker, they are looking for vulnerabilities. Is the person, do they have drugs in their life as a part of their daily life? Are they a single parent mom with kids? Do they have a family they care about? Just different elements like that, those can be used to coerce someone, basically threat of harm as an example to one of those individuals that person cares about. That threat of harm can be used to coerce someone into doing something they would otherwise never do. So those are examples of the force, fraud, and coercion.
And so before we move on, this is Erin speaking. I know a lot of you are domestic violence service providers. And so I just want to briefly kind of chime in and make the connection. You probably heard a lot of what Allison was saying and thinking, oh, there's a lot of overlaps with the people that I serve in the domestic violence world. And you're right, a lot of times human trafficking and domestic violence, especially if the perpetrator is a family member, they can look very similar. And so for our purposes today, we wanted to make the distinction that most often the distinction between domestic violence and human trafficking is this last purpose piece. And so looking at what is the purpose of the force, fraud, or coercion, the violence that is happening, is there the purpose to have that person engage in commercial sex acts or in labor or services? And if so, that likely is defined as trafficking under the federal definition. So you might be thinking to yourself, oh, I've served some of those people. And it's really common to kind of overlook, but hopefully with this distinction, if you think about what was the purpose for a commercial sex act, which could be anything that is of sexual nature exchanged for anything of value. And so it doesn't just have to be sex for money. It can be any sort of sexual act exchanged for drugs, exchanged for a place to stay. So hopefully that distinction helps you as domestic violence services providers. And I will let Allison continue to take it away.
Okay. And it's being stubborn. There we go. Okay, so we're going to look at some myths in terms of human trafficking. Oftentimes, what we see in human trafficking and what we think of as a culture is are some of the images that are pictured here. I did, and I actually about a year and a half ago did an image search for human trafficking, and then just recently did the same thing, and only a couple of the pictures changed. But this really gives us a quick snapshot in terms of what our culture views as human trafficking. And while some of these things definitely exist in a human trafficking dynamic, they are not exclusive to that. In fact, oftentimes, really what these images portray is that this is the way our victims and survivors feel in the trafficking dynamic. It is basically a symbolic representation of how this individual feels in the context of being exploited. And so just to make that really clear, you might notice predominantly faces that appear to be more female. We know that about 75 to 80% of those that are pulled into the life, they do represent themselves as female and in that context, but that leaves 25 to 20% of those who do not. And so it's important to have an accurate picture of all those that are in the life. And in addition to that, you see, the ropes and the chains and things. We're going to talk about invisible ropes in a few minutes and explain that in terms of how those that we serve feel. I want to just interject one thing. I didn't really describe very well our agency in terms of what we do. We are a direct service provision agency. My job is to do education and outreach, but we have caseworkers and case managers and others involved in basically direct service provision for anyone who has been exploited. And that is anyone who identifies in any way, any age, as long as the trafficking occurred in the United States. That is our only limitation of our grant. So just to make sure that that's really clear. Okay. Oftentimes we think of trafficking as, definitely happening. We have this data gathered in 2016 that basically says, the majority of people when asked, they think, yeah, it's definitely happening throughout the US. But when they are asked about their local community, that number goes down to 20%. And so oftentimes we want to think we're safe. We want to think that our neighborhoods and so forth are safe, that our kids are safe. But in fact, that is not the case in terms of, the general context. We know it is happening in Utah. We know that human trafficking is definitely happening throughout the United States as well. So just to kind of bring that context to light. Let's see, I want to highlight the hotline really quickly. Please make note of the number at the top. The Human Trafficking Hotline is run by Polaris. It is a federally funded nonprofit, and the number 888-3737-888 is an excellent resource. It's a great place to call if you have a tip or a question. It's also a great place for someone who is being exploited to call as well, or they can text "Be Free." We also have a lot of course, local resources here in Utah, and we're going to be sharing those with you here in a minute. I'm going to go through really quickly just some of the latest data we have from the hotline. They are working on their 2018 data, and they've promised it to us by the end of June, so we're excited for that. But this is 16 and 17 data, and this is what we're seeing. These are cases that were reported in 2017 to the national hotline, about 8,800 cases. There were approximately 17,000 calls made to the hotline, but these are the cases that were actually reported to the hotline. In terms of sex trafficking, you can see the distribution there. About 71% of those cases were sex trafficking. About half are usually children, although in 17 that number went down. And labor trafficking, 15%. You can see approximately 57% of those are females. So we have more males in labor trafficking than females. and then the sex and labor trafficking together about 4%, which oftentimes labor trafficking starts out as simply labor trafficking, but then quickly turns into a sex trafficking dynamic. So that just kind of gives you a quick snapshot of what's happening nationally. And then you'll notice a map here on the next slide, human trafficking cases in Utah. You'll see the coloration there, the red to orange. Those are the areas of Utah where the cases are most prevalent. And you'll see the cities below in the south. The lowest is St. George. The next up is Cedar City, and then the middle section is I want to say Price. And what county is Price? Oh gosh, I can't think of it right now. It's out of my mind, but there is a lot going on in the central part of the state, not just sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking, a lot of agricultural dynamics and so forth. And so anyway, that just gives you a quick idea of what's happening there. Since 2007, 810 calls have been made to the hotline from Utah. And since 2012, our agency alone has served over 531 victims. In fact, I think it's more like 610 now. We are currently serving 104 victims or survivors of trafficking. And so anyway, that kind of gives you an idea of what's happening here in the state of Utah.
This is Erin, and I am going to talk on the next slide a little bit about what you could look for if you were trying to identify trafficking in a housing situation. We can't get the slide to switch over. We'll see. I know that some of you are potentially from, oh, there we go, from housing authorities or our landlords, and we want to provide kind of tangible things that you could recognize as trafficking in your properties or in your residences, and some of these are not housing specific. So this is just great general information as well. So I won't talk about all of these in detail, but I do want to highlight especially some of the first ones as far as housing goes. High traffic in and out of residence. So some of these might trigger you to think drug activity, you can see that below, or other illicit activity, and you might be right. So some of these may not be dead giveaways for trafficking, but I do want to point out that if you see these things, take note and put it in context. And so if you do see high traffic in and out of residence, it doesn't mean that that is automatically a trafficking situation. It's just something that you might want to look into further. You can probably imagine why there could be high traffic in and out of residence. If somebody is providing any sort of service in a residence, they may be having clientele come to the residence to purchase those services. The second one about someone else paying tenants rent. If somebody is coming in that is not the resident and is seemingly financially responsible for them, but you maybe don't have as good of a relationship with them, that's something that would clue you in. There was a story, this third one, of a juvenile at a apartment complex that the apartment managers saw going in and out of other tenants' residence. And they saw it and thought that it was concerning. And fortunately, this juvenile was able to be intercepted, as you will, and she was going in and out of other residences to provide services. At that point, because she was a juvenile, regardless of the involvement of a third-party trafficker, because she can't consent, that was trafficking. And so if there's an individual going in and out of another or multiple residences, evidence of drug activity, this is tricky because drugs and trafficking aren't always related, but they commonly are related, and Allison will talk a little bit more about that. So if you do see evidence of drug activity, it may just be that, but it could also be more of a trafficking situation. Another scenario that we encountered in our work, non-family members crashing at tenants' residences. And so we had somebody that was staying in an apartment, and there was a younger person that would come and kind of crash at their residence, and there were a lot of older folks going in and out of the apartment as well. And so we were suspicious of, is this person crashing at the residence and all these people going in and out for sexual favors. So if there's a lot of people that are staying at this person's residence that aren't on the lease. That's something to just be aware of, that it could be a dynamic that is trafficking. And again, none of these are gold, you know, we got him, this is trafficking. This is just all pieces to take into context. Evidence of domestic violence, talked about that a little bit before. Allison will talk about familial trafficking, and familial trafficking and domestic violence can look very similar. And some other signs of what you could look for. This can be applicable to anybody, regardless of what service provision or landlord or housing association you're part of. But if somebody reports that they were recruited with false promises, if somebody has signs of untreated illnesses or injuries and is possibly hesitant to get care for those injuries or illnesses. This last one on that left column, again, is if any juvenile is ever exchanging in sexual favors to meet basic needs, whether that's money, a place to stay, a sandwich, drugs, that is trafficking. If you notice that someone is working excessive hours, they don't have their documents, especially if you are a landlord and you need people's documents to verify their ability to rent, and they don't have the documents, that is something to be aware of. And again, these last ones also kind of play into domestic violence as well. Controlled or restricted communication, fearful, older companion, older boyfriend is obviously a bit of a stereotype or generalization, but especially if it is a younger female with an older male or an older female. If a person is unable to speak separately alone, or if the person says that they owe money to their employer, these are all potential red flags that you could look for. And these are some things that you can just read over about asking yourself. So again, some of this behavior may initially appear illicit or appear like domestic violence. So we'll go back to this slide in a second once we can figure it out. Go back a slide. And we will talk a little bit about questions you can ask yourself in regards to. There we go. So you can see all these questions. If you are in contact with somebody, whether they live in your residence, whether they're engaged in your program, you kind of want to look for any sort of dramatic change in behavior. If a child isn't attending school, again, if a juvenile is engaged in commercial sex acts, if the person is not in good physical or mental shape, if they kind of talk in a way that appears coached, and especially if you are a part of the housing world, are they able to freely leave where they live, or are they mostly stuck in that unit unless they're able to go out with another person? That would definitely be a red flag. So these are just some questions you can ask yourself. And we are, again, happy to communicate with you if you have suspected trafficking. That is our role. We would love to help you kind of talk through it. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Allison.
Thanks, Erin. Okay, we're moving on to the top recruitment tactics for trafficking. We have recent data from Polaris Project, the Human Trafficking Hotline, as I mentioned, that for the first time ever, we have always had intimate partner or marriage, and that kind of significant other spousal dynamic always being number one. I think for the last probably 5 to 8 years, it's been number one in terms of the top form of recruitment tactics. But for the first time ever, we have familial trafficking in the top 5 for the top recruitment tactics for trafficking. That's both sex and labor. In the context of sex trafficking, it is number 2. In the context of labor trafficking, it is number 4. So we want to be really clear here that it is possible, and we are seeing that in Utah as well. We have done the data analysis as well from our local data, and our local data mirrors this data. So please keep your eyes wide open and be looking for that. Okay, so we do have a video what we want to play, but we're not sure it's going to work. So let us go to that. Let's go to that and see if we can get it to go. If not, then we'll just move on. Okay, let's see if it'll work. Okay, I'm not seeing that it's going to work. So let's move on to the next slide.
Do you want to talk through what the video was?
Yeah, it just simply was, okay, so I'm going to I don't know what's happening here, but basically the video was just a simple view of a labor trafficking context. And I just need to advance the slide. There we go. Of the labor trafficking context. And it showed several sort of younger, probably late teens, early 20-year-old people, I want to say from Laos or Cambodia. And they were being escorted from a home or a sort of some type of shelter into a van to go out and do whatever it is that they were being asked to do. And there were neighbors that were noticing this going on. And so really it was just to kind of inform the context of labor trafficking and what you might see in a residential dynamic. Okay. So real quickly, let's go into victims of trafficking. And again, I want to make very clear, we work a lot with law enforcement and of course legally. The context there is that they refer by law to someone as a victim. And so sometimes I use the word victim, but again, we never ever label anyone. We let them discuss themselves in their terms, and we simply mirror their language. So again, I use the word victim, but I will also use the word survivor and others for the context of this conversation. Okay, so vulnerabilities, you can see there are several here. These are all driven by data, and we always know that poverty is number one. It's number one in Utah, it's number one across the United States, and it's number one globally. In addition to that, what we have is the context of just a quick examination of these vulnerabilities. Homelessness is a huge issue, and substance use, that's a massive vulnerability. Traffickers are looking for a way to control someone, and so if they can be their supplier, then that's the perfect end to allowing them to be able to control that individual. History of sexual abuse or assault, and then in addition to that, child abuse and neglect. We know that child abuse, in terms of what our human trafficking survivors experience, 90% of our human trafficking survivors have experienced some form of child abuse. So that's a massive correlate. Runaway, obviously, that's another huge dynamic. There are traffickers just at bus stops, not at bus stops, bus stations, just constantly looking for someone who's getting off a bus and just kind of looking around and looking a bit lost. Juvenile justice or foster care. We know that 2/3 of our human trafficking survivors have had some contact with juvenile justice or foster care. And again, it's not necessarily the fault of the system. We have to look at what brought that person into the system to begin with. What was their home environment like to begin with? Mental health problems. Anyone who is marginalized, LGBTQ plus individuals, people who are refugees or immigrants, they are, marginalized in our society, which should not be the case, absolutely. But in this context at this point, that's the way things are in some measure. And of course, domestic violence is a massive vulnerability. And it's not just experiencing domestic violence, but witnessing domestic violence. Okay, I'm going to go back really quickly here to the power and control wheel. Okay, a variety of things here. I told you we'd be talking about invisible ropes. So this is a power and control wheel that you are very familiar with. It's been adapted by Polaris back in 2010 to put it in the context of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. You can see the variety of different dynamics that are at play in terms of the power and control. But these types of things that are listed here at the left are literally those invisible ropes. They are those things that allow someone to have power and control over another individual, and that's huge. Erin, do you want to add anything to that, or are you good? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and advance the slide. We're getting a bit short on time, and I want to make sure we give time for the housing piece as well. Okay, all right. So really quickly, in the context of where it's happening throughout the state of Utah and so forth, and also throughout the U.S. actually, you can see the variety of contexts where it's happening. Sex trafficking on the left, labor trafficking on the right. Those that have asterisks, according to the national Hotline data, those are the most common in the state of Utah. So pornography, massage parlors, on the streets, residence-based commercial sex. So that completely applies to what we're talking about here. Restaurants, and then hotels or motels, and then also homes in the context of labor trafficking. So that gives you an idea, a quick idea of where it's happening.
And something that is unique to Utah is that we have several events that happen annually, and it's just known throughout the nation that when there are larger events happening, the incidence and demand for purchased sex increases. And so you can probably think of a handful of events that Utah has. We are also a big draw for recreation, and so especially around the times that big events are happening, there is a larger demand. And so especially if you are in a housing world, the residence-based commercial sex, you would likely see an increase in activity. Whatever that looks like, you would potentially see an increase in activity.
As we all know, there's a whole lot of psychological and emotional damage that is done in the context of the trafficking dynamic or any type of dynamic where we have the power and control being asserted over someone else. Of course, in trafficking, there's a whole lot of shame. There's a lot of self-blame. A lot of the survivors we work with say, I got myself into this and I'll get myself out. That dynamic, obviously the drugs and alcohol addiction play a huge role, a variety of things here. And we'll talk about the trauma bond here in a minute. But when our agency is working with someone and trying to empower them out of the life, we don't go in and rescue per se at all. It is simply an empowerment process. When we're trying to do that, the change, even though it might be something that they want, it can be, really anxiety provoking for them. So I just want to make that clear.
And so depending on your field, if you're a housing provider, if you are a service provider, you will likely see somebody having a hard time changing. And so this kind of goes back to the behaviors that I was talking about before, whether that is the red flags, whether that's drug behavior or just behavior that's odd, and you might look at it and think that the person is a perpetrator or the person is committing crimes. You might be right, but it might also just be a manifestation of them working through their trauma and them trying to reconcile what's happened and then their now present situation of being out of that life, or even just if they're still in that situation, kind of reluctancy to leave that situation. And the stages of change is a model that looks at people's kind of ambivalence within change. And so if you are a service provider and you don't know the stages of change, I would encourage you to write it down, to go Google it later. That is a model that we work off of largely in our agency. And we all cycle through the stages of change when we are trying to make changes, whether that's stopping our caffeine habit or trying to exercise more. We all go through challenges to change. And so this isn't necessarily unique to survivors of trafficking, but their stages of change may look different than ours when we're trying to get 10,000 steps a day. So these are just some of the things that a survivor might face within the stages of change, and some things that might apply to you as housing providers or service providers. Especially if you think that trafficking is going on in somebody's life or in somebody's residence, there is often a reluctance to self-identify. Allison mentioned that a little bit before. There is often a large loyalty to the trafficker or a fear of, how am I going to change? As much as us from the outside can look in and say, why would you not want to change? This is terrible. To people who are in a trafficking context, in some way it is safe. And I don't mean necessarily physically safe or emotionally safe, but it's known to them. And so change can be really hard. because it's unknown, and the fear of failure and the fear of retaliation, even from people who've been in the life. As Allison just mentioned, people who oftentimes sex trafficking and substance abuse go hand in hand. And so that's a huge barrier for people to leave trafficking, to leave the life, and a huge challenge for people to maintain housing as well. We often see people who are running away and relapsing. People have a lot of challenges with self-esteem and self-worth, especially with the stigma that they feel from just the general population. And we are all squares to survivors. And so when they're coming from street culture, it's just so often so foreign. This is a generalization. This is obviously not everyone's experience, but they feel like they don't have anything to offer the square world. And adhering to rules and structures, if you have a housing property, this is huge. Rules and structures are really hard for somebody who is leaving a trafficking situation, oftentimes because of the rules and structures that were enforced on them by their trafficker. It can also be due to just the way that trauma messes up your brain, can be due to substance use. So you may have a challenge with that, and we are just letting you know ahead of time. A lot of times survivors have a hard time adhering to rules and structures. And the last three, again, I kind of mentioned shame and stigma, a lack of trust to people who are outside of the trafficking world. And then a lot of times people either have had mental health issues before the trafficking occurred, or because of the trafficking are now suffering from mental health issues.
Okay. Well, the other thing we want to really point out is that oftentimes we all perceive different things in the world, and as we perceive things, and as we perceive maybe those that we that are housed in in an apartment building that we're running or that we own, or a variety of contexts, but in this context of housing, they may be behaving in ways. I mean, Erin's talked about a lot of the ways that an individual might behave, and how we might not necessarily understand it from our sort of logical perspective. We haven't maybe experienced the trauma they have, and so forth. And so we might be looking with that lens of like, what is wrong with this person? And it's normal. It's normal to think that. We did a class for folks who were dealing with individuals and working with individuals who had experienced trauma. And I had this beautiful Polynesian woman come up to me at the end of the class, and she was very emotional, and she said, I think I finally get it. And she was working with her colleagues at the local detention center, and she said to me, what we do pretty much all day long is we look around at all of the youth in there, and especially at the ones that are, acting out in detention. And she said, we all say to each other, what's wrong with that guy? What's his problem? Why does he continue to act out in this way when he knows these consequences are coming? He's in detention, and, they're mandated to follow certain protocols and so forth. And so what's wrong with that kid? And she said, but I get it now. He's supposed to be acting that way because of the trauma that he's experienced in his life. He's supposed to be acting that way. And so it really lays that foundation and provides that context that really reframes the question. Rather than saying what's wrong with that person, we ought to be saying what's happened to that person to cause them to be behaving in the ways that they are. Okay, some possible questions to ask. You can see them here if you're just having conversation. Tell me about your tattoo. That's super cool. Or, if you see maybe a minor and they're just kind of there, but not really anyone else there, who's taking care of you? Or who do you live with? Or tell me about your boyfriend. Just a variety of things you can see here. And if you get into further detail, you can ask them about the details that are more involved. Kind of the lower last four questions would be a little bit more, you'd need to know that person well enough to be able to ask those questions.
And at the end of this, we will be providing you with a list of resources. So if you, from that last slide, the possible questions to ask, if you, as Allison mentioned, don't feel like you have that relationship with that person, there are still things that you can do to help intervene in what you think is going on. So specifically, if you're thinking, okay, well, I'm a housing provider, or I have an apartment building, what can you do? And we will talk about that for the rest of this time. I just want to throw in there, if you have had questions and you haven't typed them into the chat tool, please do so either now or as we continue going on, because we are able to have a few minutes at the end to respond to questions. So we really want to hear your thoughts. We would love to answer any questions that you might have. So if you are part of the housing world, or if you run a shelter, if you have an apartment complex, these are some things that you can do. So this is kind of obvious, but if you are a landlord, pay attention to what's going on in your units. If something seems off, we encourage you to look at it from a perspective of curiosity and inquiry, rather than jumping immediately to criminality or to accusation. We know that's really hard. The safety of your other residents is obviously essential as well. And so if there is a safety threat, please take the action that you need to. But instead of just, when we get the idea in our mind that this person's up to no good, it's really hard to see that maybe they are a victim. And so if you're seeing something odd in whatever sort of service provision area you're in, examine that behavior, ask about that behavior, as opposed to labeling and accusing. We'll talk about more of the opportunities that you can have with our agency, but we would love to partner with whatever your agency is to create more opportunities for survivors of trafficking. There are minimal opportunities for survivors of trafficking for housing in Utah, but I heard before that somebody's from Alabama. I bet that you are in the same boat. There's just not a lot out there, and so I'll talk a little bit about what that could look like. If you have an opportunity that you think an educational event similar to this would be beneficial, whether that's for the rest of your agency, whether that's for landlords that you work with tenants, Allison, who has been delivering the fantastic information, would be the person to contact, and her information is there. And again, we do not want you or anyone else to be harmed in the process of helping a victim of trafficking or survivor of trafficking. And so if in your properties or in your agency you sense immediate danger, please call the police. It's not safe or wise necessarily for you to approach a trafficker or somebody who might be in a trafficking situation if there's imminent danger. And we will provide this tip line again. This is for Utah specific. The Attorney General's office has the Secure Strike Force that is the trafficking specific team within the Attorney General's office. And so they have a tip line for non-emergency tips, and that is that line there, that if you believe trafficking is happening and it's not something that needs to have the police involved right away, you can call and you can leave a tip there. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about serving survivors in housing and what that looks like in our program, and what that can look like if you're not in Utah, you're not a housing provision provider. What could it look like for you? And if you are in Utah, if you're not in Salt Lake County, we are a statewide agency. And so we are based in Salt Lake City, but if you're in the rest of Utah, we would still love to partner with you. And if you're not in Utah, please go out and find somebody that is a trafficking service provider if you have any sort of resources that you can collaborate with. So in our agency and through our housing funding, we look at housing as a basic need. And so a lot of times our survivors have a myriad of needs regarding mental health, regarding substance use, education, criminal background, all of these things. But the model up until recently has been to address those and then get a person in housing. But this kind of looks at it the other way around. If you know Maslow's hierarchy, the old psychological theory that housing is a basic need and safety is on the bottom of that hierarchy. If somebody's safety needs are not addressed, they are not going to successfully be able to address needs of belonging or higher level needs like substance use or even their trauma. And our survivors often do have a lot of housing barriers. And so this is where we need to continue to build collaborations with agencies, with housing providers who understand the dynamics of trafficking, who understand what our survivors are facing, because our survivors have a really hard time just getting your apartment down the street. A lot of times they have crimes related to their trafficking. A lot of times they may have an eviction or unstable credit due to their trafficking, due to the trauma that's happened to them. And so these are things that we ought to consider as we're looking to try to find housing for our survivors. We also take a low barrier survivor driven approach. And so that means that we want people to be able to access housing regardless of their barriers, and we want them to be kind of the driver in the car. And so we try to help them overcome their barriers, and we do that through mobile advocacy. I can go and I can meet people out in the community if they don't feel comfortable coming to our offices. Like I mentioned, we are statewide. And then we have amazing flexible funding. So we can provide rental assistance if somebody just needs a couple months of rent. We can provide utilities so that they're not with their lights off in their house. We can access the voucher system within the community of continuum of care or within other housing authorities. And we have flexible funding to help survivors stay housed. And so even if that's fixing a car because they need their car to go to work, which will then help them pay the rent, we are able to do that. And that's a beauty of the grant that we have. And our survivor driven approach, Allison has mentioned that we try to empower our survivors as much as we can. With housing, it's such a personal decision. And we want to A, equip them so that they can maintain housing, but B, most importantly, help them feel like they are the ones that are leading the way in making their housing decisions. And I've kind of touched on this a bit throughout. We use a housing first model, which is a national model that looks at people's barriers as something that can be addressed once they're in housing. And people throughout the country, you can see this number here, one program has had retention rates as high as 98%. And so this is kind of the model that we base our services off of. Again, every survivor is unique, and every survivor has different needs. But we all the time want to keep in mind, how can we help them find safe and stable housing, whether that's shelter, whether that's transitional housing, whether that's permanent housing. It's going to look different wherever they're at and whatever stage they're at. But we want to not create barriers and rules for them to get into housing. Like, you must address your substance use before you can get into housing. So that's based off the housing first model. And there's some evidence to show that it is a decreased taxpayer burden because people who are stably housed are going to have a lot less health issues, which means less trips to the emergency room, less 911 emergency calls. So this is a national model that Utah has been using for a while, so you might be familiar with it. And so what we do, we can serve survivors of trafficking who are either chronically homeless, have been homeless for a night, they're imminently homeless, unstably housed, or housed. And so we look at housing within a holistic case management model. And so we try to make a unique plan for each survivor. And so they can be homeless, they could be housed. We are able to do different things for everyone. As you can see below, we're able to provide emergency assistance, like putting people in hotels or shelters, short-term assistance, like quick rent, transitional assistance, helping them get into an apartment with security deposits, application fees, housing location, and then long-term assistance. We are able to access voucher programs within the state and provide intensive case management. And so you are able to refer people to us if you have folks that you believe are victims of trafficking. And these are some of the services that we can provide within our holistic case management. I've touched a little bit on this before, that we do have flexible financial assistance. And if you're already serving a survivor of trafficking, we are often able to come in and provide quick, flexible financial assistance, whether that's you don't have the funds to pay for their driver's license, we can. And so please reach out to us if you have any clients like that. And a big part of what we do is collaboration with other service providers and housing agencies. And so you taking the time to be with us this morning and think about your programs and how we could best collaborate to serve survivors is really imperative in what we do. And so thinking to yourself, okay, well, what can I do in whatever service provision area you are? And again, if you're not in Utah, this still applies to you. If there are trafficking service providers in your state or in your area, please reach out to them. And for our needs specifically, as I mentioned, there are a lot of domestic violence shelters around the state that we do have partnerships with. And we are always needing beds for survivors to go quickly. And so if you're listening and you think, I don't have a partnership with them, I would be happy to take some of their survivors into my emergency shelter. Please reach out. We are always in need of emergency shelter, obviously, as your clients are as well. If you are part of a housing program, if you're a landlord, we would love you to reach out to come on board with us, and we can kind of collaborate. What do you have, what do we have? How can we create more options for survivors? Whether that's we create a scattered site model with one of your housing units, and we have a couple units that our survivors can stay in with us providing short-term rent assistance, or whether that's your housing provider and you want to connect us to certain vouchers for people who have experienced trauma or violence. We would love to have you on our team and help us serve our survivors. And that final piece there is we would love to create a better training, I guess, for folks who are being housed for the first time. It's really tricky, and you, especially as a housing provider, want somebody to be successful and not cause problems in your housing as much as we do. And so if you feel like you have a housing skill or life skill that you want to help some of our survivors learn, we would love for you to reach out and partner with us in helping our survivors learn how to maintain stable housing.
Thank you so much, Erin. All right, we'll conclude here. Just wanted to kind of make the point with each of you. This young man was discovered by neighbors, and they just saw really sort of odd patterns of traffic inside, going into the home. He was being trafficked by his family. As you can see, he's now a survivor advocate. We are all neighbors. We are also have the potential to see things in our professional context as well. And so just kind of being aware. And one last thing I think we would offer is trust your gut. And that is very unscientific, but truly has been the impetus for a lot of inquiry and tips that have actually proven to be in reality trafficking situations. So please, I would just echo or say that piece. Finally, this is a context, I guess, where you might, these are options for you in terms of resources and contact dynamics. Obviously, as Erin already mentioned, if you sense an emergency is at play, or you're witnessing something, please simply call 911. The Human Trafficking Hotline is the 888-3737-888. And then the Utah Attorney General's tip line, which Erin already gave you, but this is another quick snapshot of that. That is for non-emergencies, and they will get back to you. I think it's within, I want to say 10 to 12 hours, but they are usually on it each day. And then there is a Utah Trafficking in Persons Task Force. If you have questions or your agency wants to be a part of the task force, please call the number that's listed there. That is a collaborative task force between our agency and the Utah Attorney General's office. And then finally, there's our program for referrals or coordination of referrals. You can contact our coordinator, Alessandra Amato, and then also Erin is listed there. And then finally, we have just a bit of references for you if you want that in terms of our dynamics. But that, I think, does it for us. Do we have any questions? Okay. Let's see.
All right. Thank you for that. That was very informative. I feel like every time I listen to one of your presentations, I learn more and more. If anyone else has any questions, we can get those answered right now. Just submit those to the question box. The one question that we did have is, will the slides be available after the presentation?
So that is an excellent question. We would love to make this information available. Our grantor does not allow us to hand over a presentation. So I think what we'll do is chat with Andy about the details, and we will let you all know if there's a way for us to do that. I believe this is being recorded, and so it is possible to go back and review the recording, and that may be probably our best bet. We want to honor the wishes of our grantor, and so we need to be respectful of that. But also, please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any direct questions you have as well.
You can go train
or I can also go throughout the state and do training for any of your agencies. I would be delighted to do that, and our grant covers that and pays for that. So that is cost-free, and I'm happy to do that.
Awesome. Yeah. So this will, you will all receive a link for the recording in an email either, tomorrow or a couple days after the webinar, and you'll be able to watch it there. And also it will be available on the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition's YouTube page. We have a number of different recorded webinars on there that are available for you to watch absolutely for free. And you can have a little more control on what part to watch. And someone did ask if we could get a copy of at least the contact slide, and we can get you the contact information for all of these. That would be excellent. It looks like that's all the questions we have. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Have an excellent day, and hopefully you attend our webinar series for the rest of the summer. Thank you, and have an excellent day.